The dawn over the Blue Ridge Mountains always arrived like a slow, deliberate forgiveness, spilling soft amber light across the damp, pine-scented porch where Julian sat with his cold tea. For 3 long years, since the quiet collapse of everything he had spent his youth building, time had lost its crisp edge, blurring into an endless gray continuum of survival rather than living. The sprawling wooden farmhouse, inherited from a grandfather who measured wealth in well-tended timber rather than bank ledgers, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gentle vault holding the fragile remnants of his spirit. Every floorboard groaned with the memory of steps he could no longer take with joy. And the silence inside the high-ceilinged rooms was so dense, it almost had a physical weight against his ribs. Outside, the autumn leaves were turning, vibrant, unapologetic crimsons and golds that seemed mockingly alive against his internal winter. He traced the grain of the cedar railing, his hands calloused from months of mindless restoration work, fixing joists and shingles as though mending the physical house could somehow stitch together the frayed edges of his own broken story. Yet deep beneath the exhaustion that coated his throat like dust, there remained a faint, stubborn ember of curiosity, a quiet whisper that refused to be completely extinguished by regret. It was the simple, human craving to feel useful again, to believe that a life shattered into countless sharp pieces might still be reassembled into something capable of holding light instead of just shadows. The stillness broke later that morning when a battered pickup truck rattled up the gravel driveway. Out stepped Clara, an elderly neighbor whose face was a map of soft wrinkles and quiet resilience, holding an old leather-bound case in her weathered hands. Without the customary preamble of modern polite society, she walked up the wooden steps, her eyes bright with a keen, compassionate clarity that seemed to look right through Julian's carefully constructed armor. "My grandfather's old violoncello has been gathering dust in the attic for 40 years, Julian," she said, her voice rich with the steady rhythm of someone who had survived her own share of harsh winters. "The wood has dried and split down the back, and the soundboard is cracked. But I remembered how your hands used to craft magic out of timber before you locked yourself away in this lonely valley." Julian stared at the battered case, feeling a cold knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. For he had vowed never to touch the art of lutherie again after his finest workshop burned to ashes, along with all his dreams. To repair an instrument was to engage in an intimate dialogue with damage, to sit face to face with vulnerability, and he wasn't sure if his heart could withstand such scrutiny. Yet, as Clara gently placed the case on the rustic outdoor table and unlatched the brass hinges, revealing the wounded, satin-varnished wood within, something inside Julian shifted violently, a sudden and undeniable ache to reach out and heal. When Clara left, Julian remained standing beside the workshop table, staring at the cello like a man confronting an old ghost that had refused to stay buried. The crack ran diagonally across the spruce top, a sharp, jagged wound that looked irredeemable at first glance, mirroring the unspoken fractures he carried within his own breast. For years, he had operated under the unspoken delusion that beauty lay exclusively in wholeness, that once a thing, or a person, suffered a catastrophic rupture, its intrinsic purpose was forever compromised. He ran his fingers along the fractured spruce, feeling the rough edges left by time, tension, and seasonal shifts, and felt a profound lump rise in his throat as he realized how harshly he had judged himself. We live in a culture obsessed with flawless surfaces, discarding anything that shows a scratch or a scar. Yet here was an object that had preserved its soul through decades of neglect, simply waiting for someone patient enough to acknowledge its pain. His fear began to evaporate, replaced by a quiet, holy reverence for the brokenness itself. Recognizing that the crack was not an indictment of the wood's failure, but a testimony to the immense tension it had endured while creating music. To turn away from the cello now would be to abandon the last remaining bridge back to his own humanity, a surrender to the numb safety that had kept his soul in exile for far too long. He gathered his long-neglected tools from the dusty drawers, the delicate brass clamps, the carved wooden glue pot, and the razor-sharp thumb planes, feeling their familiar weight anchored in his palms like old friends offering silent encouragement. As he carefully cleaned the splintered edges of the spruce, he remembered the ancient philosophy where broken ceramics are repaired with lacquer mixed with gold, honoring the history rather than hiding the break. He realized that mending this cello would not mean erasing its history or restoring it to an imaginary past, but rather weaving its suffering into a new, richer narrative of endurance and grace. With slow, rhythmic movements, he prepared small maple cleats to reinforce the seam from within, breathing in the comforting scent of warm glue and shaved wood that filled the quiet workshop with a forgotten warmth. Each precise stroke of the plane felt like a quiet prayer, a conscious release of the guilt he had carried over things he could never change, replacing regret with the tangible labor of restoration. His hands, once trembling with self-doubt, grew steady and sure, guided not by a desperate need for perfection, but by a profound love for the act of creation itself. In the quiet rhythm of shaping wood to heal wood, the boundary between the craftsman and the instrument blurred. And for the first time in 3 years, Julian felt the suffocating constriction in his chest loosen, making room for a long, clean breath. By the time the afternoon sun dipped below the rugged ridge, casting long, golden fingers across the workshop floor, the cello stood secured in its clamps, its seam tightly joined and reinforced with quiet precision. Olian stepped back, wiping his hands on a linen apron, and looked out the window at the valley below, which no longer appeared bleak or barren, but alive with possibilities. The physical wound in the wood remained visible, a subtle dark line tracing the journey from fracture to wholeness. But it no longer looked like a flaw. It looked like a seam of strength, a scar worn with dignity. He realized then that healing was never about returning to who we were before the storm, but about becoming someone wide enough to hold both the pain of the past and the promise of the dawn. The heavy silence that had haunted his farmhouse for years now felt transformed into a spacious, expectant quiet, the kind of silence that precedes the first brilliant notes of a symphony after a long rest. Tomorrow, he would apply the final varnish, and Clara would return, and together they would listen to the cello sing its rich, resonant song once more. A song made sweeter precisely because it came from a voice that had been broken. Taking a deep breath of the cool mountain air, Julian smiled a genuine, unforced smile, stepping out onto the porch with a light heart, ready to live again. The silence of... For years, Arthur had worn his grief as a second skin, a quiet armor forged from the echoes of laughter that once filled these narrow corridors and the lingering scent of rain on pine needles. Every corner of the room seemed to whisper of what used to be, holding fast to the ghost of a warmth that had long since faded into the twilight of his memories. He would sit by the north-facing window for hours, watching the amber light of late afternoon bleed into the bruised purples of dusk, wondering if a heart could truly learn to beat to a different rhythm after its primary song had ceased. The world outside continued its frantic, indifferent dance, rushing toward tomorrow's, while he remained anchored to the wreckage of a yesterday he refused to abandon. Yet, beneath the stagnant pool of his sorrow, a microscopic current of curiosity began to stir, whispering that perhaps the pain was not merely an anchor dragging him down, but a map tracing the contours of what he was still capable of feeling. It was a terrifying realization, one that threatened to dismantle the very fortress he had spent a lifetime building against the unpredictable mercies of tomorrow. Morning arrived without fanfare, slipping through the cracked window panes in long, pale fingers of silver that chased the lingering shadows from the corners of the room. Arthur stepped outside onto the porch, the cool morning air biting sharply against his skin and startling his senses awake with a sudden, vivid clarity. The forest was waking up in a symphony of emerald greens and damp earth, every leaf heavy with the promise of a dew-kissed dawn that cared nothing for his past sorrows. He looked out past the tree line, where the horizon blurred into an infinite expanse of soft, hazy blue, realizing with a sudden, breathless ache that the world had not stopped turning just because his world had broken. A lone hawk carved lazy circles against the canvas of the waking sky, embodying a freedom that felt both foreign and deeply inviting to his weary soul. In that quiet moment of communion with the wilderness, the suffocating tightness in his chest loosened just a fraction, replaced by the faint, unfamiliar flutter of a pulse long thought dead. It was a small, fragile grace, but it carried the weight of a monumental shift, suggesting that survival was merely the prelude to an altogether more demanding art of living. Healing, Arthur discovered, was not a grand cinematic revelation that struck like lightning, but a slow, agonizingly tender process of picking up jagged pieces and learning how to hold them without drawing blood. Over the following weeks, he forced himself to walk the overgrown trails that wound deeper into the valley, confronting the ghosts that hid behind every gnarled oak and moss-covered boulder. He remembered the laughter they'd shared beneath the canopy of stars. But instead of letting the memory crush him into the dirt, he allowed it to wash over him like a cool, cleansing rain. Each step forward felt heavy, burdened by the sheer inertia of decades spent looking backward, yet each breath tasted slightly sweeter than the last. He began to notice the small, miraculous details he had blinded himself to for so long. The stubborn resilience of wildflowers pushing through cracked stone, the intricate geometry of a spiderweb glistening with morning mist, the steady, rhythmic pulse of life continuing unabated. These fragments of beauty did not erase the scars of his loss, but they offered a different perspective, framing his wounds not as permanent defeats, but as the intricate map of a journey that had somehow brought him safely back to himself. Change, when it finally took root, blossomed in the most unexpected places, creeping into the quiet corners of his solitude, like sunlight breaking through a dense canopy. Arthur began to frequent the small village at the foot of the mountains, engaging in slow, hesitant conversations with locals whose faces were etched with their own quiet histories of endurance. He listened to the baker talk about losing a son to the sea, and to the elderly librarian who spoke of finding solace in the infinite worlds hidden between the pages of forgotten books. In the shared vulnerability of these simple exchanges, Arthur realized that human suffering was not an isolating prison, but a vast, invisible web connecting every living soul in a silent, unbreakable fellowship. He no longer felt like an outcast, stranded on the desolate island of his own grief. Instead, he felt the comforting hum of a larger community, wrapping its arms around his battered spirit. They did not offer easy answers or cheap consolations, but simply the profound gift of presence, reminding him that the deepest wounds are often the very channels through which empathy and true understanding flow. Standing once more on the crest of the hill as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of copper, violet, and gold, Arthur felt a profound sense of peace settle over his bones. The journey had been long and fraught with shadows, but the person who stood watching the sunset was not the same broken man who had locked himself away from the music of the world. He understood now that life did not ask us to forget our sorrows, but to carry them forward as badges of honor, proof that we have loved deeply enough to weather the fiercest storms. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of approaching rain and the infinite promise of tomorrow, urging him onward into the unfolding chapters of his unwritten story. With a steady hand and a heart finally open to the vast, terrifying beauty of existence, he took a deep breath and smiled into the gathering dusk. The darkness was no longer something to be feared, but merely the canvas upon which the stars of a new dawn were waiting to write their luminous, enduring song. The freezing wind eventually drove us all inside, seeking refuge in the very living room I had so arrogantly claimed as my own personal domain. Melissa Brooks, still trembling from the realization of her catastrophic professional negligence, confirmed in a fragile whisper that the buyer's cash funds would remain securely frozen in the agency's escrow account until legal ownership was fully resolved. Desperation flared hot and bitter in my chest, a wild, untamed instinct to regain control of a situation that was rapidly slipping through my fingers like dry sand. "This is absurd!" I shouted, my voice shrill and echoing off the walls as I pointed an accusatory finger at my father-in-law. "If you block this sale, Ethan and I will file for divorce, and I will hire the most aggressive litigation attorneys in this state to secure half of your assets." Howard Jenkins did not flinch, his calm, authoritative demeanor remaining entirely unbroken by my frantic emotional outburst. He leaned forward slightly, adjusting his glasses, and delivered a devastating legal truth that severed my last remaining lifeline. "You are welcome to consult any attorney you wish, Mrs. Carter," he replied with surgical precision. However, under strict state law, inherited wealth held within a separate, irrevocable private trust is classified entirely as non-marital property. Because these specific funds were never commingled with your joint accounts, they are completely exempt from any divorce division. My breath caught sharply in my throat as the staggering reality set in. The immense fortune I thought I could leverage was legally, permanently untouchable. Before I could formulate a coherent response to his devastating legal blockade, Howard reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a neatly stapled stack of printed correspondence. He placed the papers onto the antique coffee table, revealing a series of private emails I had exchanged with the real estate agency over the past 3 weeks. My heart plummeted into my stomach as he read my own arrogant, calculating words aloud to the silent room. "Ethan doesn't understand modern business. We will explain everything to him after the closing is completely finalized, and he has no choice but to move." Hearing my manipulative strategies spoken in Howard's steady, objective voice stripped away all the clever rationalizations I had used to justify my deceit. Ethan looked directly at me, his eyes reflecting a profound, quiet sorrow rather than the explosive anger I had anticipated. But the most damning revelation was not my cruelty. It was the fact that Ethan had been meticulously copied on every single one of those emails. He had read my cold plans to displace his own father. Yet he had never replied, never objected, and never defended the man who had sacrificed everything for him. His silence had been a cowardly, implicit agreement, a passive endorsement of my ruthless ambition. Looking at my husband's pale, deeply ashamed face, I realized that my relentless drive to secure our financial future had not only exposed my own moral bankruptcy, but had completely destroyed the foundational integrity of the man I had married. The oppressive silence in the living room deepened as Howard pulled one final, deeply personal item from his briefcase, a sealed ivory envelope bearing familiar, elegant handwriting. He handed it gently to Ethan, explaining in a hushed, reverent tone that Michael had entrusted him with this exact letter before passing away, leaving strict instructions to deliver it only if greed ever arrived at his front door. My father-in-law stared at the envelope, his calloused thumb tracing the 6 quiet words written across the front. For Ethan, when the truth arrives. The emotional weight of that simple inscription seemed to anchor the entire room, extinguishing the last remnants of my defensive fury. With trembling hands, Ethan broke the seal and silently read the final advice of the brother who had loved him fiercely enough to anticipate this exact betrayal from beyond the grave. Though he did not read the entire letter aloud, he looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and shared the core philosophy that Michael had left behind to guide him through this darkness. He warned me that my kindness would eventually be mistaken for weakness, Ethan whispered, his voice cracking with a profound, healing sorrow. He told me that if greed ever demanded entrance, I should not answer it with bitter revenge, but with unvarnished truth, because truth always outlasts deception. Those quiet, devastating words cut through my remaining illusions like a scythe, leaving me entirely defenseless against the overwhelming realization of the profound damage I had so carelessly caused. Suffocated by the crushing weight of their collective judgment and my own undeniable guilt, I surrendered to a blind, desperate instinct to escape the house immediately. I refused to stand there and be quietly dismantled by an old man and his attorney, clinging desperately to the final shreds of my shattered, toxic pride. Snatching my heavy designer handbag from the console table, I threw my tailored winter coat over my trembling shoulders, my face burning with a mixture of profound humiliation and unrestrained defensive rage. I am not staying in this freezing, hostile house for another minute just to be insulted and lectured by you, I snapped, my voice rising in a panicked, hysterical shriek as I turned sharply toward the heavy front door. I am checking into the downtown Marriott immediately, and I will deal with all of my high-powered litigation lawyers from the comfort of a luxury suite. I stormed out into the bitter December night, deliberately slamming the heavy oak door behind me so violently that the frosted glass panes rattled in their frames. The frigid Wisconsin wind immediately bit into my cheeks, but the physical cold was nothing compared to the icy isolation that settled over my heart as I marched toward my parked car. I drove away from the quiet suburban street with my tires spinning furiously against the ice, leaving my silent husband and the wreckage of our deeply fractured marriage firmly behind me, desperately convincing myself that my credit cards would provide the ultimate sanctuary. 20 minutes later, I strode confidently into the grand, warmly lit lobby of the downtown Marriott, dragging my expensive suitcase across the polished marble floors while desperately clinging to my fragile illusion of superiority. I approached the elegant mahogany front desk, fully expecting the seamless, deferential VIP treatment I had grown accustomed to, as I haughtily handed the receptionist my primary gold credit card. The clerk offered a polite, practiced smile and inserted the chip into the security terminal. But instead of the satisfying whir of a printed room key receipt, the machine issued a harsh, negative beep. A bright red error message flashed aggressively across the point-of-sale screen, reflecting in the clerk's apologetic eyes. Transaction declined. Panic flared in my chest as I quickly rummaged through my designer wallet, extracting my secondary platinum card and demanding that she swipe it again, blaming a temporary banking glitch. The clerk processed the request, only for the banking system to return the exact same instant, devastating result. Transaction declined. The crushing, undeniable reality crashed down upon me with the force of a falling building. My authorized user access had been completely revoked, and the joint accounts were firmly frozen due to the massive, unchecked balances I had carelessly accumulated during our lavish Hawaiian vacation. Standing utterly paralyzed in the center of that luxurious, bustling hotel lobby with zero access to cash or credit, the total financial and emotional collapse I had so arrogantly orchestrated finally became my inescapable, terrifying reality. The afternoon light slanted through the dusty window panes of the old farmhouse, casting long, bruised bars of amber across the warped pine floorboards. For months, Julian had lived in the stagnant quiet of his own exhaustion, a solitary ghost moving among the silent relics of a life that had fractured somewhere between misplaced ambition and profound despair. The indoor air tasted of dry cedar and forgotten summers, heavy with the phantom echoes of laughter that no longer belonged to anyone. Outside, the vast, unbroken expanse of the Midwestern prairie rolled toward a pale, indifferent horizon. A landscape so relentlessly wide, it either crushed the spirit or invited it to vanish entirely. He stood with his palm pressed against the cold glass, feeling the steady, stubborn thrum of his pulse against his wrist. It was a strange, terrifying realization that the world did not stop turning simply because one's personal universe had imploded. The cottonwoods continued their rhythmic bowing to the wind. Crows traced jagged calligraphy across the darkening sky. In this quiet crucible, Julian finally understood that true healing was never the absence of pain, but the sudden, uninvited permission to stop fighting the ghosts of what might have been. To linger in the wreckage of his former certainty was to deny himself the deep, unearned mercy of a true ending. With a slow breath tasting of dust and renewal, he loosened his grip, letting the heavy latch click open. Moving into the kitchen, the silence took on a different texture, less like a tomb and more like a held breath waiting to exhale. He ran calloused fingertips along the edge of the butcher block table, tracing scars left by decades of hurried meals, shared secrets, and quiet grief. Every home held its own mythology, a secret architecture built from mundane rituals of survival and grace. Julian struck a match, the sulphurous hiss breaking the quiet like a sudden punctuation mark, and set the flame beneath an iron kettle. As the water began to murmur its rising song, he pulled a chipped ceramic mug from the shelf, a relic left by the previous tenant, or perhaps by some wandering version of himself. There was a sacred humility in these small, repetitive actions, stitching oneself back into the fabric of the living world one thread at a time. We spend so much of our lives chasing grand epiphanies, he thought, while salvation usually hides in the simple act of boiling water and waiting for steam to rise. The vapor curled upward, blurring the reflection of his tired eyes in the window pane. In that blurry glass, he did not see a failure. He saw a man standing in the gray dawn of his reclamation, willing to listen to the quietest corners of his heart. The kettle whistled, a sharp, clear note piercing the stillness, calling him forward into the unfolding hours with a gentle, insistent grace. Stepping out onto the porch, the crisp evening air embraced him with a cool, earthy scent of damp soil and ripening wheat. The sun was dipping below the tree line, smearing the western sky in strokes of bruised violet and burning marigold, painting a magnificent masterpiece of transience. Down the gravel lane, an old neighbor, a woman named Clara, whom he had barely spoken to in 2 years, was tending a patch of late-blooming asters, her hands dark with garden soil and age. She looked up, shading her eyes against the fading glare, and offered a nod that asked for nothing and offered everything. It was a greeting untainted by pity or expectation, simply one human acknowledging another across the quiet spaces of rural solitude. In that unspoken exchange, Julian felt a sudden softening in his chest, an emotional thaw frozen beneath layers of pride and self-reproach. We are never truly islands, no matter how high we build walls of isolation. Invisible threads of shared vulnerability bind us to the earth. Clara turned back to her flowers, her posture steady, a testament to endurance in a world that constantly shifts. Julian closed his eyes, drawing the evening air deep into his lungs, feeling tension drain from his shoulders. The world was vast, scarred, and overwhelmingly beautiful. And for the first time in an eternity, he felt that he belonged right here, in the middle of it. Sitting on the wooden steps of the porch, Julian opened an old, leather-bound journal. Pages left blank for seasons, afraid of what his own handwriting might confess. He picked up a pen, the nib hovering over crisp white paper, like a diver poised above a dark lake. The ink began to flow, not in the frantic, accusatory scrawl of his past self, but with a slow, deliberate cadence, mirroring his breathing. He wrote about mistakes feeling like anchors, ambitions turning to ash, and the quiet grief of letting go of the person he thought he was supposed to be. There was profound liberation in confession, in laying down heavy armor and admitting that he was simply human, fragile, imperfect, and deeply beloved by the universe anyway. Forgiveness is not a lightning bolt striking you whole. It is a slow accumulation of daily choices to stop punishing yourself for being unfinished. He looked up at the Milky Way, stretching like a luminous highway across the dark vault of heaven, feeling small, yet infinitely connected to everything. The stars did not rush, nor did they apologize for distance. They simply burned, casting ancient light across the dark night. Closing the journal, Julian felt lightness settle into his bones, the quiet assurance that his story was far from over, and that every shattered piece could be rearranged into something stronger and wiser. The morning sun rose over the prairie like a promise kept, burning away nocturning mist in ribbons of golden vapor that danced across the grass. Julian stood on the threshold of his home, feeling the cool draft of a new dawn brush against his face with the crispness of a blank page. He had spent so much of his life looking backward, haunting the ruins of yesterday. But today, the road ahead stretched out clear and luminous. Healing is not a destination where all wounds vanish. It is the courage to keep walking with scars, knowing they are proof of survival rather than defeat. He took his first step off the porch and onto the gravel path, the crunch of stone beneath his boots sounding like a steady, purposeful drumbeat of renewal. The world was waking up around him, birds singing in the cottonwoods, dew sparkling on spiderwebs like scattered diamonds, and the vast sky offering an infinite horizon of possibility. He did not know what the coming months would bring, whether joy or sorrow, triumph or struggle. But he no longer feared the unknown. He was equipped with patience, rooted in the earth, and anchored by a profound sense of his own worth. With a smile touching the corners of his eyes, Julian walked forward into the bright morning light, ready to write the next chapter of his life, with ink made of courage, grace, and an enduring, fierce hope that refused to be extinguished. The morning arrived not with a sudden blaze of golden theater, but with the quiet, hesitant gray of a New England dawn lifting over the damp shingles of the old barn. For months, Caleb had lived in the sharp, narrow space between what had been and what he refused to become. His days measured by the slow ticking of a grandfather clock that felt more like a judgment than a measure of time. Yet today, as the mist unraveled across the dew-drenched pasture, something inside him loosened, not like a snapped cord, but like a tightly wound knot, finally acknowledging the gentle persistence of warm fingers. He walked out onto the porch, his bare feet meeting the cold, weathered wood that had known decades of relentless weather and unrecorded grief. He looked out at the tree line, where the pines stood like silent sentinels, guarding the boundaries of his solitude. In that still, breath-held moment, he realized that healing was not a grand reclamation of a lost paradise, nor was it a miraculous erasure of the scars carved deep into his palms. It was simply the courage to stand in the wreckage of yesterday without cursing the wind that brought the storm. The air tasted of pine resin, wet earth, and the faint, sweet promise of a day untethered from old regrets. He took a long, deep inhalation, feeling the cool oxygen fill the hollow spaces of his chest. And for the first time in an age, he did not look away from the horizon. Later that morning, the rhythmic scraping of metal against whetstone broke the silence of the backyard. An industrious song that Caleb had inherited from a grandfather who believed that dull tools were an affront to living. He sat on an upturned wooden crate by the shed, holding the old scythe blade that had rusted in the damp corner since the autumn before last. Each pass of the steel required a deliberate focus, a steady pressure that forced his racing thoughts to settle into the present cadence of friction and spark. It was during this quiet labor that Clara appeared by the garden gate, carrying a woven basket filled with stubborn roots and winter-hardened soil she intended to revive. She did not speak at first, respecting the sanctuary of his concentration with the easy grace of someone who understood that words could sometimes weigh heavier than silence. She simply leaned against the post, her weathered flannel jacket catching the morning sun, watching the silver blade gradually reclaim its edge under his patient hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the small expanse of yard, there was no need for explanations or apologies about the years they had spent drifting apart in the same house. The unspoken history between them, all the missed signals and quiet sorrows, hung in the air like autumn smoke. Yet it no longer choked them. Instead, it felt like fertile ground, rich with the decomposed remnants of bitter seasons, waiting quietly for whatever seeds they might choose to plant together. They spent the afternoon working side by side in the garden, turning over the heavy, sleeping earth that had lain neglected through the long months of Caleb's isolation. With each turn of the shovel, it felt as though they were unearthing layers of old identity, shedding the heavy armor of pride and defensiveness that had kept them both safe, yet profoundly lonely. Clara knelt by the furrows, her gloved hands gently breaking apart clumps of clay to uncover the pale, resilient shoots of perennials that had survived beneath the frost. Watching her, Caleb felt a sudden, sharp pang of tenderness, recognizing how much grace it took to remain open-hearted in a world that so easily bruises the spirit. He reached out to help her lift a particularly heavy stone, their fingers brushing momentarily against the rough canvas of their work gloves. In that small, ordinary contact, a wave of profound relief washed over him, washing away the lingering debris of his self-doubt. He understood then that life was not measured by the absence of pain, but by our capacity to keep tending the garden of our hearts long after the frost has cleared. The sun dipped lower, casting long, amber shadows across the freshly turned soil, illuminating the sweat on their brows and the quiet solidarity that had silently rebuilt their bond. It was an awakening, born not of grand epiphanies, but of mud on their knees, the smell of damp earth, and the quiet, miraculous courage of choosing one another. As twilight settled over the valley, painting the sky in bruises of violet and orange, they walked back toward the farmhouse with slow, tired steps that felt deeply earned. The kitchen was warm, filled with the simple aroma of simmering broth and the soft glow of a single brass lamp sitting on the windowsill, guiding them home. Inside, they washed the dirt from their hands at the basin, watching the dark water swirl down the drain, taking with it the physical exhaustion of the day and the psychological weight of years gone by. Sitting at the wooden kitchen table, eating a modest meal of bread and soup, Caleb felt a profound sense of integration settling into his bones. The house no longer felt like a monument to what they had lost, but a living shelter, holding what they were still becoming. He looked out the window at the dark outline of the hills, recognizing that the road ahead would still hold its share of uncertain weather and shadowed nights. Yet fear no longer held the steering wheel of his soul. He had learned that resilience was not an unyielding wall against adversity, but a flexible willow that bends with the gale and springs back upright. In the quiet warmth of the kitchen, surrounded by the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the gentle murmur of Clara's voice recounting a memory from their earlier years, he felt completely, undeniably anchored. The broken pieces of his history had not vanished, but they had rearranged themselves into a mosaic. Later that night, long after the house had grown silent and the fire in the hearth had settled into a bed of glowing embers, Caleb stepped out onto the porch one final time before bed. The night sky was an immense, star-studded canopy, vast and indifferent, yet profoundly comforting in its infinite expanse. He breathed in the crisp night air, feeling the deep, steady rhythm of his own heartbeat, matching the quiet pulse of the sleeping world around him. He thought of the seeds they had planted that afternoon in the dark earth, waiting patiently beneath the surface for the warmth of tomorrow's sun. He realized that every ending was merely a prelude to an unwritten chapter, a chance to begin again with wiser hands and a gentler heart. Healing was not a destination one finally reached and settled into forever. It was an ongoing practice of grace, a daily choice to honor the past while refusing to let it dictate the future. As a single shooting star streaked across the dark velvet of the cosmos, he made no grand wish, for he already possessed everything he needed, right here in the quiet stillness of his restored life. He smiled into the dark, whispering a silent word of gratitude to the storm that had broken him open, knowing at last that the light he had searched for so desperately outside had been burning quietly within him all along, waiting patiently for the dark to teach it how to shine brilliantly into the vast, unwritten future. The October air carried the crisp, mineral scent of decaying leaves and distant wood smoke, settling over the valley like a soft, woolen blanket. Julian stood at the edge of the abandoned orchard, where the gnarled apple trees stood as silent sentinels to decades of forgotten harvests. There was a quiet dignity in their weathered trunks, twisted by time, yet stubbornly rooted in the unyielding earth. For years, this landscape had been synonymous with a fracture he thought could never be mended, a geography of loss etched into every rolling hill and slate-roofed barn. He had returned not to conquer the ghosts of yesterday, but simply to sit with them in the waning afternoon light. The golden sun cast long shadows across the frost-kissed grass, painting the world in shades of amber and bruised violet. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. Rather, it felt pregnant with the weight of unsaid things. He adjusted the collar of his worn wool coat, feeling the chill seep through the fabric, anchoring him firmly in the present moment. Every breath was a small act of reclamation, a conscious choice to inhabit his own skin after a long, self-imposed exile. The wind whispered through the brittle canopy above, a gentle rustle that sounded remarkably like an old friend offering a long overdue welcome home. In this vast, indifferent wilderness, he realized that true healing was never a destination one arrived at with fanfare, but a slow, quiet unspooling of the deep human heart. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished brass pocket watch, its glass cracked like a spiderweb during that bitter winter 5 years ago. It had belonged to his grandfather, a man who had coaxed life from stubborn soil through sheer grit and unwavering faith. Holding it now, Julian felt the cold metal bite into his palm, serving as a tangible bridge across the chasm of estrangement and regret. Memories rushed forward, unbidden and sharp. The slamming of doors, the angry words hurled like stones in the hallway, and the suffocating pride that kept them apart until it was too late to say goodbye. For years, he had carried those moments like a jagged stone in his chest, wounding himself every time he dared to draw a deep breath. Yet, as he watched the second hand refuse to move, frozen in perpetual stillness, an unexpected realization bloomed within his chest. The watch wasn't just a monument to a broken relationship. It was an invitation to stop punishing himself for the inevitable tragedies of mortal existence. Grief, he understood, in that quiet sanctuary of falling leaves, was merely love with nowhere left to go, pooling in the dark corners of memory like stagnant rain. By opening his hand and letting the cold autumn breeze wash over his palm, he began the sacred task of forgiving not only the ones who had left him behind, but the fragile, fractured boy he used to be, back when the world was young and entirely full of terrifying, impossible, bright, enduring dreams. A sound broke the reverie, a sharp snap of a twig followed by the soft rustle of dry underbrush. Turning, he saw a lone deer standing at the tree line, its dark, liquid eyes fixed on him with a startling, fearless curiosity. For a suspended second, man and beast shared the same breath, bound together in the quiet theater of the woods. The creature did not bolt. Instead, it lowered its head to graze briefly before turning back toward the deeper forest, disappearing as seamlessly as mist vanishing into the morning sun. That fleeting encounter felt like a silent benediction, a reminder that life continued its rhythm regardless of human sorrow. Nature demanded no explanations, harbored no grudges, and kept no ledgers of past mistakes. It simply renewed itself, season after season, offering beauty in the wake of decay. Julian felt a profound softening in his shoulders, the tension of years melting away like frost under a rising sun. He thought of all the energy he had wasted trying to rewrite history, trying to force the river of time to flow backward into dead canals. The deer had shown him the grace of simply moving forward, of accepting the turn of the seasons without fear. In the cathedral of the woods, surrounded by towering pines and the amber breath of autumn, he understood that his story was far from finished. There were still chapters waiting to be written in ink that had not yet dried on the blank page, waiting patiently for his return to this quiet sanctuary of grace. With this realization came an overwhelming wave of emotional release, washing over him like clean rain after a stifling drought. He walked slowly toward the old wooden fence bordering the property, resting his palm against the rough, splintered cedar rails that his grandfather had nailed into place half a century ago. Under his fingers, The wood was cold yet solid, bearing the scars of countless winters and scorching summers, without losing its structural integrity. It struck him that human lives were much the same. We are forged not by our unbroken perfection, but by the resilience we find when our foundations are tested by storms. He closed his eyes and whispered words of forgiveness into the empty air, directing them toward the absences that had haunted his nights for so long. The bitterness that had poisoned his tongue dissolved into the breeze, replaced by a profound, radiant lightness that he had not felt since childhood. He no longer needed apologies that would never come, nor did he require closure delivered on someone else's terms. True freedom, he discovered, was something one carved out of the wilderness of one's own wounded spirit through the courageous act of letting go. The past was a country he had finally finished visiting, and as he turned his back on the old orchard, he felt the heavy iron chains of resentment slip from his wrists forever, dissolving into the quiet earth to nourish the roots of whatever beautiful new life tomorrow might choose to plant in that fertile, welcoming resting place. Stepping out onto the gravel path that wound down toward the valley road, Julian took his first unhurried steps into the gathering twilight. The sky overhead was an exquisite masterpiece of watercolor, blending streaks of vermilion, burnt orange, and deep indigo as the stars began to quietly puncture the firmament. He felt alive in a way he had almost forgotten, every sense attuned to the vibrant pulse of the universe and the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. The road ahead was unlit and uncertain, stretching into the dark expanse of an unknown horizon. Yet, for the first time in his life, he felt no fear of the dark. He carried the warmth of the afternoon sun within his bones, and the hard-won wisdom of acceptance safely nestled in his soul. Whatever lay ahead, whether joy or sorrow, triumph or quiet trial, he was ready to face it with open arms and a resilient spirit. He was no longer running away from his memories, nor was he hiding from the shadows that had once defined his existence. He was walking forward as a complete, unbroken human being. The world was wide, patient, and full of infinite grace, waiting for anyone brave enough to claim it. With a final, lingering look back at the tranquil valley, he smiled into the evening wind, turned his face toward the beckoning dawn, and finally walked on home, with a joyful heart beating proudly against his chest under the bright, starry canopy of the autumn evening sky.